Our featured BBB Wise Giving Alliance accredited charity seal holders for this episode are ALS Association, American Indian College Fund, Delivering Good. To find out more about these and other BBB Wise Giving Alliance accredited charity seal holders, go to give.org.
You're listening to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor, powered by bbbgive.org. Here we explore the motivations that form the basis of giving and service. We inspire generosity and celebrate the transformative effects that giving and service have on the human spirit and on community. The conversations featured on the podcast also uncover giving strategies that educate and provide tools to help listeners make impactful gifts of both their time and money. We hope you enjoy this episode.
This is the Heart of Giving podcast, powered by bbbgive.org. Give.org is the nation's standards-based charity evaluator, and it's your one-stop source for information on giving and reports on the most asked about charities. I'm Art Taylor. Today, my guest is Stanfort J. Perry, CEO of AHRC Nassau, Citizens Options United Incorporated, and Brookville Center for Children's Services. For more than 30 years, Stanfort has dedicated his career to advancing independence, health, and safety of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Today, he leads one of the largest networks of nonprofit disability service agencies in the nation as the CEO of the organizations I mentioned. So today we're going to get into a conversation with him about his life and his work, and I know we're going to learn a lot about the conditions and opportunities for people with developmental and intellectual disabilities. Stanfort, welcome to the Heart of Giving podcast.
Art, thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to be a part of this podcast. I'm looking forward.
Well, Stanfort, let's just start out with an overview of the current crisis facing nonprofit disability services in the United States, particularly for those with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
That's a great place to start. The field over the decades that we have operated as an entity providing supports to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities is now enduring a crisis like we have never seen before, especially in terms of direct support professionals. Those are the people who provide hands-on services to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we across the nation are having a very, very difficult time recruiting and retaining this important element of our workforce. This is primarily due to the lack of funding, governmental funding that supports these programs across the nation. And as a result of the diminishment of funding, we're finding that the ability to attract people to this work, which is very challenging and difficult at times, has become beyond what I would call a crisis at this point. We have passed the crisis point, and the lack of the recruitment and retention of direct support professionals is indeed impacting our ability to operate programs for people and families with disabilities successful.
Now, you've been doing this for 30 years in different contexts, and your organization is celebrating its 75th anniversary. What do you see as the driving force for the challenges that you're seeing with direct support professionals in the industry?
I think there are a number of elements that are really exacerbating this crisis that has been developing now for a number of years. When we look at the fact that people providing the work are being paid in many states minimum wage, which basically means that people who are providing supports and services to other people who rely on them for their quality of life are paid the same wages as someone who works in a fast food restaurant flipping burgers. And in some instances, they're paid even less. They're paid the same as workers in retail, the same as an individual in a grocery store. And not that those jobs are not important, but providing supports to people with disabilities requires that in many instances, we are supporting their daily activities for life. Things like helping to feed them, taking care of all of their personal needs and hygiene issues, providing opportunities for partnerships and friendships to integrate them into the community. Most people, 99.9% with intellectual and developmental disabilities, do not drive a car. So we must transport these individuals from point A to point B every single day and throughout the day. The ability to pay those staff who do the work an equitable wage is one of the major challenges driving the inability to recruit and retain this very important workforce. People are drawn to this work because they want to make a difference in the life of another individual. And they come in with all good intentions. They start to do the work and they realize in my day of work, I have to pass medications. I have to take care of all of the personal needs for this person. In some instances, I'm lifting and moving people who may be immobile, who may be non-ambulatory, folks who are in wheelchairs. Some people are restricted by their movement because of the nature of their physical disability. So after doing that work for several months, staff begin to realize that I am not being compensated in an equitable manner for the work that I am performing. And so after they form these relationships and they get to know these individuals who they're supporting, they realize that the work does not equal the pay, and then they leave. And when they leave, it creates then another cycle of hiring a new person to only have them come in and stay for several months, maybe half a year, and then they leave as well because they realize that the value of my work does not equal the pay that I'm giving to do that work, which is a real challenge because the success of our field as an agency that provides supports to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is contingent upon relationships. So we have staff, direct support professionals who've been with us for 30 years, sometimes even more, sometimes a little bit less. It's those relationships and getting to know the person with the disability that makes a real difference in being able to provide the necessary supports and services that that individual needs. Many of our people cannot speak. Many of our folks have autism. They're on the autism spectrum. So being able to understand their wants and needs and desires requires that you get to know the individual. So when a person leaves after just 2 or 3 months of employment and a new person has to come into that individual's life, we can only imagine the level of disruption that that causes in the life of a person who requires steady and ongoing partnerships and relationships in order to live their best lives.
Let me just ask you, when I think of the challenges that you are mentioning relative to how your support teams are compensated, I want to know, in your estimation, what is the gap? How far off as a percentage, let's say, of salaries are we short? What would it take to get those salaries where they need to be? And secondly, what does it say about our society that we are struggling to find a way to get these devoted staff people compensated in a way that they can actually make a living?
Those are great questions, Art. The first response would be the equity factor. Where should we be elevating raises? Where should we be elevating the pay to ensure that people are being paid an equitable rate of pay? The standard occupations classification is the system in the United States that's used to help us collect and gather data on the work that professionals do in a variety of different occupations all over the United States. When you look at people who do similar work, you'll find that oftentimes they're paid anywhere from $22 to $25 an hour to do that work. Direct support professionals in New York State now are making minimum wage $16 an hour. So we're about $8 off per hour what the field would require for people who do similar work in a variety of different settings for people who are challenged with a variety of disabilities. So it's a great gap, a pretty significant gap in terms of the pay equity that's necessary. I think in terms of valuing the lives of people with disabilities, it does speak to our perspective as a nation, as a community, when our most vulnerable citizens are not receiving the level of supports necessary to live a high quality life. It also speaks to this as an inclusion opportunity. And it also speaks to the civil rights of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities as well. The advocacy for the proper inclusion of people with disabilities has been something that has been ongoing. 34 years ago, the ADA was passed, and that particular act helped to ensure certain rights and opportunities for people with disabilities. The American Disabilities Act was key legislation that helped to some degree, level the playing field for people with disabilities. There are many other provisions that we continually advocate for that must be put into place to ensure that as a community, as a nation, as a state, we begin to acknowledge the inequities that exist for people with disabilities, and then we create opportunity that is often driven by laws and regulations to ensure the full inclusion of people with disabilities within our respective communities. So there is still a high degree of advocacy that occurs at the federal level and at the state level around Medicaid, around Social Security, around SSI benefits, and other forms of support to ensure that people with disabilities are given opportunities for equity within our nation. So it does speak to very clearly to the fact that people with disabilities are often not at the table, are often not included simply by virtue of their disability. In many instances, folks with disabilities are invisible. Unless you have a family member with an intellectual or developmental disability, you might not see or engage with people with disabilities. They don't make the headlines like you see with many other folks or some other groups of disabilities in our nation. They don't make headlines in any way, shape, or form. And so I think families have spent a great deal of time ensuring the safety and the protection of people, their family members with disabilities. So communities don't often understand the complex needs, behavioral, medical, social, and other needs of people with disabilities, and how, as a community, we should go about ensuring their full inclusion.
So AHRC, I see, is one of America's best in state employers. Somehow you've managed to achieve that amazing recognition despite some of the challenges that you're having with your people. I guess that even goes to show just how dedicated they are and what a great job you all do supporting them. But what other factors do you think contribute to you becoming one of these best in state employers?
We were honored to be selected by Forbes as a best in state employer, and they named AHRC as one of New York's best in state employers because of the work that we do. And I think there are a number of factors that led to this designation by Forbes. The fact that we take very seriously our mission, that families and individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities really drive our mission. So we don't exist simply to operate as an agency or as an employer. We simply exist because of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They're at the forefront of our mission. Our board of directors is made up largely of family members of people with intellectual and developmental disability, and also includes people that have intellectual and developmental disabilities on the board of directors. So I think when Forbes selected our organization, they saw that we were mission driven. We also have a very robust DEI strategic plan, diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan, and policies and procedures that advance equity across all levels of our organization. In addition to that, we're innovative. We create opportunities where they do not exist for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. In terms of job creation, opportunities for continued employment, opportunities for individuals to engage in community inclusion activities also exists within our family of organizations, which I believe also were factors that impacted the Forbes decision. In addition, we are also a Compass agency, and New York State has an office for people with developmental disabilities, and that office has named, out of 500 providers in the state, 4 providers as being Compass agencies. And Compass basically means it's the highest level of accreditation that you can receive from the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities in New York State. And we're proud that 2 of our agencies, and there are only 4 in the entire state of New York, but 2 of our companies, AHRC Nassau and Citizens Options Unlimited, are named as Compass providers. I think that also factored into the Forbes list. And we're also accredited by the Council on Quality and Leadership, which is an international accrediting body that has about 300 agencies, 350 agencies that they accredit across the world internationally. 7 of those agencies are actually accredited with distinction, and we're honored to be one of the 7 that are accredited with distinction as well by the Council on Quality and Leadership. All of that means that we take quality very seriously. We take the services that we provide to people with disabilities very seriously. And we work to make sure that we provide a very strong and robust program, along with some innovation, opportunities for employment and growth, and personal development as well.
And now it's time for our Giving Tips segment with Bennett Weiner, one of the world's most renowned experts on charity accountability and the COO of the BBB Wise Giving Alliance.
Today I'd like to talk to you about child sponsorship charities. This is a type of giving that has been around for a long time, and many donors are interested in this because they feel they're getting a direct involvement with a person in need. I would suggest to make sure you understand how your sponsorship dollars are going to be used. In most instances, charities are pooling their sponsorship funds to support a community project like schools, medical clinics, or clean water initiatives, that type of thing. rather than providing direct cash transfers to an individual sponsored child. So review the charity's materials or appeals to see how they describe they will use sponsorship funds that are collected. The other thing is, don't assume that you're going to have a one-on-one relationship with a sponsored child when you participate. There are some charities that facilitate correspondence, often letters that go through the charity first for translation and vetting purposes. But visiting the sponsored child is usually not encouraged, and it's not something that's likely to happen. And of course, research the charity's website to learn more about them, and visit give.org to see if the charity meets the BBB charity standards so you can feel confident in getting involved with this particular organization that you chose. The other thing to think about is determine if you're comfortable with the charity's overall philosophy and approach. In other words, in some cases, some of these sponsor groups have religious affiliations that may guide their work. That might be a more positive thing, or that might be a concern for you. If they are, there are lots of other sponsorship groups out there you can consider that do things differently. And if you do get involved with any type of correspondence with a child, be prepared for delays because translation and mail challenges in some regions take time. So the key to understanding this is knowing how your sponsorship commitment is going to be utilized by the charities and verifying that they're accountable and meet standards before you make a commitment to make an ongoing financial pledge to them.
Tell us about the Wheatley Farms and Arts Center, and what services are you offering there, and how does it align with your overall mission?
Well, Wheatley Farms and Arts Center is our latest innovation, and we're very proud of the work that's happening there. It's an opportunity for the community, actually, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and people that do not, together daily in this very wonderful space in Brookville, New York, a very bucolic environment where there's farming going on, lots of agriculture. We have animals there for people to engage with as well, horses and a couple of peacocks and some ducks and chickens that lay eggs. The whole farm experience is there. In addition to that, it's a place of mindfulness. So people can come, connect with nature, sit by some of our water features that we have there to just enjoy the quiet of the trees and the earth and the animals, to just get away from it all and to really commune with nature while also engaging in some very meaningful ways with each other. We also have, as a part of Wheatley Farms, an arts center, a piece that is centered on the arts. So there's dance and body movement, there's yoga, there is drawing and artistic endeavors that take place in this space as well, along with music. Lots of music where people can sing and dance and record and enjoy themselves in this integrated environment that on a daily basis includes people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and people that do not. Because we believe that it's important that folks with disabilities are in no way separated from the larger community. So on a daily basis in this wonderful environment, people come together to ensure that there is a high degree of respect for each other as we work to also learn basic skills that many of our people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who come there can use and apply to the larger community. So I mentioned we have chickens that lay eggs. The chickens that lay eggs, along with the agriculture and the gardening and everything else we do, is to create opportunities for farm to table experience. So we teach people in this environment how to take the fruits and the vegetables and the eggs and to prepare them in a healthy manner so that they can learn skills that they can use through our educational and pre-vocational programs and apply those skills to the actual community. People can use these skills to get jobs in restaurants and in various places where those skills are needed. As you may know, the restaurant industry is having a very difficult time recruiting and retaining staff as well. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities make great employees. And when they are trained to do specific tasks, we have found that they are the most reliable group of people you could ever want in your company. And we encourage employers and companies, restaurants, offices, hospitals, you name it, to look at people who are neurodiverse, who may be different in some way or another, but can indeed perform the job and perform it well. And we have found through the hundreds of people that we have placed in competitive employment and through opportunities that we've created at AHRC Nassau, at the Brookville Center for Children's Services, and at Citizens Options Unlimited. We've created opportunities to make sure we are employing people with intellectual and developmental disabilities on a daily basis who have performed exceptionally well and are able to give back to their communities because they're now earning a paycheck. They're not just relying on public support or support from Medicaid to survive. But when people with disabilities are given the opportunity to work and to earn their own money, that money goes back into the communities in which they live, and they are now contributing members, taxpayers, like everyone else in their local communities.
I wanted to just get into your background a little bit. You've been doing this for 30 plus years. What drove you to choose this as a long-term career and way of giving back to society?
You know, I'd like to think that the field of intellectual and developmental disabilities chose me. I started out after undergrad school with a degree in psychology, working in a group home as a temporary sub-staff. I was the guy that they called in when the regular workers couldn't come to work. And so I would go in as a sub-staff whenever they needed me to assist as a direct support professional at a time when the wages for a direct support professional were about $2 or $3 higher than the minimum wage. So we weren't dealing with this issue of the lack of payment or anything along those lines, and we had no problem recruiting people with college degrees to work in this field. And after I started as a direct support sub, I then became a full-time direct support professional and found that this was my calling, that working with people with disabilities was something that I saw as easy and natural and a very good fit for who I was as an individual. I come from a family of 7 siblings, so there are 8 of us total.
Wow.
And working in a group home where you have 6 or 7 or 8 people living there seemed like a no-brainer to me. I came from a family of 8, so having a house full of people who needed to eat dinner and who had to work together to solve problems and to get along was something that was very organic and natural for me. So when I started in this group home that actually had 14 people living there, it was a natural fit for me. It was another form of a family. And we found that people who live together in our group homes, many of them have been together for 20, 30, 40 years. They are indeed family to each other. And the staff who work in those programs become extended family to those people who rely on them in many instances for everything in their lives. And that's why those direct support staff are so critical to this work, because they become the link and many times the voice, the eyes, and the ears for the person who has an intellectual and developmental disability to the outside world.
What are some of the examples of these extended family members that you could share with us that bring you, I would say, joy in your work?
That's a great question. And, Art, I've had the privilege of having joy in my work for almost 40 years, having every day be a day that I look forward to going to work. And I've been very lucky that I've been able to do work that is very meaningful to me. And along the way, I have met a variety of individuals who have added so much value to my life and the life of each other and the families that we support. There are a number of people that I have encountered along the way where we have indeed made a difference. I think about a young lady who is in the program here at AHRC Nassau when I started, and this particular young lady wanted to move out of the group home to give it a start on her own. She wanted to move in with her brother. Both her parents had died, and our staff were very concerned about her being more independent in the community. And was she really ready to go out on her own to make this work? But she was so committed to living her best life and reminded us that our goal was to help her live her best life and not what we wanted for her.
Mm.
And as a result, she took this big step probably 8 years ago now, and it worked out perfectly. She's now much more independent. She lives in her own apartment. She comes to work every day. She is a leader and an advocate for other people with disabilities. She speaks publicly on Zoom calls in Washington and in Albany and so many other places as a voice for people who are in her similar situation. And she represents what can happen when people are supported to live their best lives.
That's fantastic.
And so that's just one of many, many stories like that of people who have come to me with disabilities and said, Mr. Perry, I want a job. I need to work. It's great that we have these social programs. It's great that you have day opportunities for me to do things that I like, but I want to work and I need more money in my pocket. And so we have programs that allow us to then train people to work. We have pre-vocational opportunities so that we can teach you a skill that is needed in the workplace. And you take that skill, and then we will give you a job coach who works with you, and we will shop you around to 100 different employers until we find the right one for that individual. And they give folks with disabilities an opportunity and they give people a chance. When employers do that, there are countless number of lives that have been changed as a result of people being able to work and to earn a paycheck. And there are many, many stories like that here at AHRC Nassau, but across the state and across the nation of what can happen when employers work with providers like AHRC Nassau to make a difference in the lives of people. We also have other instances. I had a family member come to me about 4 years ago to tell me that they wanted an opportunity for their daughter, who is what you might call severely physically disabled, has extreme difficulty walking, is nonverbal, but can let you know in her own way that she is appreciating life around her, that she is engaging with her environment in positive ways. And this particular family was the impetus for the creation of Wheatley Farms and Arts Center, because they simply said to me, I want a place that my daughter can come to and engage with animals and dig in the soil and just be herself in a fun, creative environment. So as a result of what this family member said to me, now hundreds of other families are benefiting from that particular suggestion. So we exist to respond to the needs of our family members. And it is difficult when we have families who now come to us with their goals, their dreams, and their desires. Or we have individuals who come to us, people with disabilities, and we cannot develop that program. We can't open the new group home. We can't create that new opportunity because we cannot find staff to work in the programs.
Let me ask you, what over the last 30 years has changed? So if you were to go back, 30 years when you basically first started in your career, what's changed in this field that you would say is now less optimal or maybe more optimal for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities?
Another great question, Art. What has changed tremendously is the funding support for this field. When I started in the field, there was a serious recognition of the work that was being performed. And there was funding that ensured that we could recruit and hire and retain staff at wages that were far above minimum wage. Once we went to an across-the-board minimum wage with no recognition of the value and the challenges and the difficulty of the work that direct support staff must perform, we then saw a major difficulty in recruiting people to do this work. So over the last 30 years, the biggest change has been the type and the level of funding to do the work that we do, especially funding for direct support professionals. And the field must make the necessary adjustments in order for us to continually thrive as an advocacy organization, as a movement that is dedicated to the lives of people with disabilities, if we are to survive and get out of this crisis over the next several years. As a result of the low wages that we're seeing and the lack of equitable pay, which primarily in the New York metropolitan region affects women and people of color, the majority of our direct support staff are women.
Mm.
And the majority, again, are women of color who are doing this work,
Wow.
who are most affected by the lack of wages and the lack of pay for the work that they are doing. So this is an equity issue. This is a diversity issue. This is an inclusion issue that we must grapple with to ensure that we are treating people in the manner that is reflective of the very difficult and challenging work that they perform on a daily basis for peoples whose lives depend on their very existence in order to survive.
Wow. Well, Stanford, we're going to have to leave it there, but I just want to say how impressed I am with your commitment to supporting people over the last 30 plus years who have intellectual and other types of disabilities and for advocating for them. The services represents obviously one piece of it, but if there's no one standing up for them, there's no one sharing with those of us who frankly don't know what's going on. There's no one sharing those stories. If there's no one telling us about the problem, telling us that we need to pay more attention to the society that we are creating by not supporting people to the extent that they should be and the workers who support them, then we would get nowhere. And the conditions would, I would argue, be probably a lot worse than they are today. So I want to thank you for that. I also want to just thank you for agreeing to be a part of the show and giving us a chance to get the word out about what you're doing and also the state of affairs nationwide for people who are doing the kind of work that you're doing. This is really important information for us to have because, again, as you mentioned, if we're not connected to someone directly who is dealing with these specific disabilities, who needs the kinds of services that you're offering, we probably don't think about it very much. So you have to shine that light. You have to make sure that we're aware. And I want to thank you for being on the show and giving us a chance to do what we can with this program to make other people aware. And for all of you, this is Stanfort J. Perry, and he's, as I mentioned, dedicated his life to this. He is the CEO of the AHRC Nassau, Citizens Options United, Inc., and the Brookville Center for Children's Services. And he's doing all of this work, I would argue, as one of the good angels that we have in our society, helping people so that they can help themselves. And this is the best I think we can ask of anyone who's working on behalf of people in our society. So I want to thank you, and I appreciate you joining the show.
Art, thank you very much for helping us to underscore that disability rights are civil rights. And we invite your listeners to, at any time they desire to support an agency like AHRC Nassau, to reach out to us, and we're more than happy to engage folks. They can simply go to ahrc.org to volunteer, to help out, to join in, and to be a part of the efforts that we are engaged in moving forward.
Well, for all who are listening to this podcast for the first time, it's the Heart of Giving podcast. You can find us on all major podcast platforms. I hope you will subscribe and listen to our shows as they come out each Tuesday. If you want to support the show, you can do so by going to give.org, which is the website for the BBB Wise Giving Alliance. And you can make a gift there, and we will be very appreciative and put that money to great use. Thank you for listening.
You've just listened to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To listen to our other interviews, visit heartgiving.podbean.com. That's heartgiving.podbean.com. Subscribe to our show on major podcast platforms. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guests, not those of the BBB Wise Giving Alliance or program affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Podbean's terms of service.